you guys up, I guess. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next one. This will be our last one as well. Okay, so the Huffington Post has been identified as a leader in national environmental headlines in the US. So what percentage of their headlines do you believe relate to environmental? So is it above or below 25%? Yeah, 24% or lower, everyone's saying. I would say that too. I'll give you about 10 more seconds to get those. Everyone's saying, oh, one person said higher. Everyone's saying lower. Okay, and I'm gonna reveal that answer now. So the answer is 3%. So it's definitely lower. Alrighty. Let's see, did we want to get started on the talk now? Around 3:05, a good time to get started. Awesome. So I'll hand it over then to Claudia. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks everyone for playing. That was fun. I'll hand it over to Claudia just to go over some of our welcome remarks. So Claudia, if you want to take over.
Hi guys. I'm Claudia. I'm one of the co-presidents for the Environmental Student Union, and we just wanted to welcome you to our last webinar of the summer. So this is the 5th webinar in the summer series, and this is co-run by the School of the Environment and the Environmental Student Union. And so in this webinar's team, we have Jessica, who is the school's event coordinator. We have myself, who is the student union co-president, and then we have my other co-president, Emma, who just did the start activity, and then our faculty moderator, Tanhum. And so just make sure that during the presentation you keep your mic on mute, and we'll be watching the chat for any questions or concerns. Emma?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Claudia. So I'm just going to walk us through our setup for the webinar today. So for today's webinar, we'll be having a talk presented by Tzeporah Berman. It's going to be about 45 minutes long, and she'll be exploring the Great Disconnect and proposing some new solutions on how we can engage in a safer, cleaner future. So after that talk at around 4 o'clock, we'll be sending you all into breakout rooms. So that'll be for about 10 minutes. And you'll have the opportunity to write down any questions you have for Tzeporah and also discuss with each other the webinar. After that, we'll come back as a group, and then we can talk about these breakout room discussions. That will lead into a Q&A with Tzeporah. As a note, just so you guys know, the webinar will be recorded. This recording is only done during the talk itself and the Q&A, so the breakout rooms won't be recorded. And if you need, there are closed captions available. We recommend using the transcript function, so you can select that in like the More tab, just because it's a little bit more reliable for you guys. That's all of our housekeeping. So I'll move on with our land acknowledgement. So given the nature of this event, I know we all join this space from different areas. So I'm going to speak on the land that I personally reside on, and that's my space in Toronto. And I'll acknowledge the land in which the University of Toronto resides on as well. So this land has been and continues to be the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. So as a settler myself, it's important that I participate in educating myself and understanding my place in our country's ongoing history of colonization. So land acknowledgement is only the beginning, and it's important we do more as an institution and as individuals to recognize the privileges we hold from the stolen land we reside on. So I'm able to live on this land, I'm afforded an education on this land, and I know that we have to do more to recognize how these privileges I'm awarded to were at the expense of Indigenous people. So my own actions to do more than this, and more than just a land acknowledgement, lie in actively choosing to educate myself on Indigenous voices within my field, which is environmental studies, and amplifying those voices. So I challenge everyone to do the same in ways that they can. So working towards representing and supporting those voices. Not only do they deserve to be heard, but we benefit more as a community when we support and uplift these voices in our field. So thank you for listening to that. I'm now going to hand it over to Tanhum just to present our speaker and some of our other contents.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. and welcome to all of you who have joined us from near and far for what is our final webinar of the summer. Wow, that went by incredibly quickly, but we've saved a big treat for last, and we're all going to have the privilege of hearing from Tzeporah Berman today. Before I do that, just one housekeeping item. I hope that you've all taken the opportunity to read the departmental expectations of conduct. It applies in person, but it also applies on Zoom. It's a short one-page document, so please make sure that you've read that. And so that's the housekeeping item. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Tzeporah Berman. I think that if I read all the accomplishments that Tzeporah had done, we would have to cancel the webinar and just focus on me and reading Tzeporah's bio. So I've naturally whittled it down to one page. So here we go. Tzeporah Berman has been designing environmental campaigns and working on environmental policy in Canada and beyond for over 20 years. She's currently International Program Director at Stand Earth, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Committee. She's also an adjunct professor of York University Faculty of Environmental Studies. She's the former co-director of Greenpeace International's Global Climate and Energy Program and co-founder of Forest Ethics, now Stand Earth. Tzeporah was one of 6 Canadian nominees for the Schwab Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award, has been profiled as one of 50 visionaries changing the world in Udney Reader. She was honored by inclusion into the BC Royal Museum permanent exhibit of one of 150 people who have changed the face of British Columbia. And sort of as an addendum to that, I can say that we are all impacted by Tzeporah's work, whether we know it or not. In 2019, Tzeporah received the Climate Breakthrough Project Award, which included $2 million to create breakthrough global strategies on climate change. In 2013, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of British Columbia. Corporate Knights named her one of the top women in sustainability Canada, and she was nominated for Climate Woman of the Year by responding to climate change. Tzeporah was one of the creators and lead negotiators of the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement and the Canadian Boreal Forest Initiative. Her works contributed to the protection of over 40 million hectares of old growth forests. Among more recent projects, Tzeporah helped to design the Clean Our Cloud campaign that led Apple and Facebook becoming international leaders in using renewable energy for their data centers. In 2016, she was listed as one of the 35 most influential women in British Columbia by BC Business Magazine. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the person described by Reader's Digest as Canada's Queen of Green, Tzeporah Berman.
Wow, thank you so much, Tanum, and to all of you who have been organizing these webinars. I'm really excited to be here, and also really enjoyed our discussions in the lead up to the webinar. Emma, thank you for that beautiful land acknowledgement, and I just like to also acknowledge that I'm here today on the unceded territories of the Klahoose First Nations. I'm on Cortes Island in British Columbia's west coast, and you know, you've covered a lot of ground on why we do these land acknowledgements, and the only thing that I think I would add is that part of my commitment a couple of years ago to my own decolonization process was to read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then the recommendations that were made through our Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Both were hard reads, and it took a long time to kind of really understand them, but I just really urge people to look at those 2 documents. I learned so much through that. So when we were talking about this webinar, we started the conversation around eco-anxiety. And I think all of us feel some sense of that today, regardless of what you're doing or what your profession is, that you can't, you know, turn on your computer or even just to have a conversation with a friend right now at the grocery store, and not feel some sense of anxiety because the what we hear every day. Yesterday I read that a lot about the California fires, about the fact that a third of Bangladesh right now is underwater and hundreds of thousands are displaced. It's a constant drumbeat of climate impacts and environmental degradation, and that can leave us not only anxious, but feeling what I've started calling this great disconnect. That, either you feel a disconnect because, you're hearing about all this devastation, but where you are seems pretty good. Where I am seems pretty incredible today. Or it's a disconnect because we hear about the climate emergency and even have our governments declaring the climate emergency, yet simultaneously subsidizing increased fossil fuel expansion. In Canada, the LNG Canada project, which if it goes forward, would be the single largest point source of pollution in the country, one of the largest LNG facilities in the world, and would result in a dramatic increase in fracking in Canada, or as the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which we heard about in the questions that you asked at the beginning. How do we make sense of these disconnects and how do we deal with our own anxiety was really how we started the conversation. And I decided today to approach it with you in the way that I approach it in my life. I truly believe that action is the antidote to despair. It has been for me. This is now it's an old bio that said 20 years. This is now a almost 30-year journey for me, which actually started at U of T in 1991, I think. And the way, when you read about environmental issues every day, it can lead to a lot of despair, especially if you're have the opportunity and the privilege that I have had to be right in the halls of power. I've been appointed to a number of government commissions now and leadership teams to develop policy, and the climate leadership team in British Columbia. I co-chaired the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group in Alberta on climate policy in the oil sands, or even in the halls of the UN. And many of those initiatives haven't resulted in the change that we need to see. And that can be really hard. And for me, the way I approach this and are able to kind of get up every day and keep going is to identify clear objectives and participate with others who share my concerns, and to be able to see progress. And I think that's increasingly critical as we move forward. So I have this poster above my desk, action is the antidote to despair. It's something that I really hold dear. And I thought that what I might do today is take you a little bit on my journey to tell you about what I've done, some of the things that have worked, how I approach these issues. And I kind of structured the talk almost like a meta talk in that I invite you to think about how I'm talking about the issues. Because the conversation that I'm hoping to get to is what you're thinking about doing, what we can do to make change. Because there are a lot of people who could sit here and be experts on policy or experts on climate change and present you with the statistics. You can read and probably do read the statistics every day. I don't consider myself one of those great policy experts. But more my field is trying to understand what makes social change. Why does change happen? Why do decision makers pass some laws and not others? Why do corporations institute some policies and not others? And how can we impact them as individuals or as organizations? That is essentially what I've studied and practiced for 30 years. And I think I've learned some things about how to make change. I've been involved in a lot of campaigns over the last 30 years. A number of them have been successful. Some of them haven't. And so that's what I want to share as we talk about the issues, is a little bit into the window of how I do that analysis, and how I try and make change. And so I thought that it would be appropriate to start at U of T, because that's, for me, where my journey started. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Can you see my first slide? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Great, thank you. So my journey started here with, in fact, this exact photo, which I saw at a geography class at U of T in my undergrad. And it was in that class that my professor started telling me about the temperate rainforest and how Canada had some of the last remaining old growth temperate rainforests in the world, trees that can be over 1,000 years old, 300 feet tall. And I remember thinking like that it was kind of crazy that I'd heard about Brazilian rainforests, but I really knew nothing about Canadian rainforests. And that summer, it was the summer of 1991, that's how old I am, I bought a pair of hiking boots and spent all the money I had left on an airplane ticket and went to British Columbia to see the rainforests and to find out what was going on for myself. And I fell in love. I fell in love with these incredibly complex, beautiful forests and all that live in them. I spent a number of years doing, helping support scientific research in the rainforests. And I was pretty devastated to find out that despite how little there was left on the planet and how important these forests were, they were being logged at, and are still being logged, but logged at even greater rates back to make newspapers, phone books. I remember when I first started doing supply chain research and I found out that the Yellow Pages phone books, which are obviously now don't exist, or probably exist less, were being made out of 1,000-year-old trees. So at the time, we were logging about an acre of ancient rainforests in British Columbia every 60 seconds. And I started at first doing research, and we actually proved through our research coordinated with the University of Victoria that endangered seabirds, the marbled murrelet, depended on these forests for their habitat. And I thought at the time that if we just provided the information, that people would, that would change the policy. And so we provided the scientific information. We proved that these birds were dependent on these forests to survive, and the logging continued unabated. In fact, the area that this is a photo from the area that I had been studying at the time in the Walburn Valley, wow, which still affects me 28 years later. I came back the second summer of my research and it had entirely been logged. I found out that the local community up in Tofino was protesting. I had never been to a protest in my life, and I decided to join them. And you know, the rest is history. The protests that summer in Clayoquot Sound in 1993 became the largest civil disobedience at the time in Canada's history. Over 1,000 people were arrested. 10,000 people came to the protests that I helped coordinate with the Friends of Clayoquot Sound and others. I was arrested and charged with 857 counts of criminal aiding and abetting and faced 6 years in jail because I had been one of the primary organizers of the protests. That's a very long story that I tell in my book if you're interested. But in the end, I was acquitted because, in fact, you can't aid and abet an individual's personal choice to do civil disobedience. But the fact is, the logging continued. Even after the polls were showing that the far majority of Canadians supported the permanent protection of Clayoquot Sound, and even after all of those protests. And so that for me was the first moment when I started really thinking through what makes social change, what's happened in other movements in history. How do we actually get the government to listen or corporations to listen? it seemed like a complete failure of democracy, that the polls were showing that the majority didn't even support this, but it was continuing. And I decided to follow the power and really look at who had the power to make change and who were they being influenced by. And I would say that that's kind of something to hold on to through this talk. And it's been probably one of the most important lessons that I've ever learned, is to really look at who could make the change that you want to see in the world. And although the government of British Columbia had the power to protect Clayoquot Sound and to make the change, what I realized through our analysis is that they were listening almost entirely to the logging companies. The logging companies were incredibly powerful with that government, and the logging companies were listening to their customers. And so, although we tried to meet with the government and the industry at the time, the industry refused to meet with us. The government didn't take us seriously. We decided to follow the money and to follow the power. To this day, I believe that decision makers are influenced by three things. One is that they're influenced as individuals and they'll make choices as individuals. Decision makers are just people. I think the best example of that might be Gordon Campbell. The reason we have a carbon tax in British Columbia is because of Premier Gordon Campbell. And it's certainly not because of the Liberal, provincial Liberal government's climate policies. It's because Gordon Campbell himself had his own climate reckoning. And he pushed as Premier to ensure climate policies. So it could be the individual themselves. And other than that, it's some combination of money and power. So what will it cost to make the changes we want to see? Who has the financial power to influence governments? Money or people. So governments look to their next election, even if they've just been elected. And so whether or not there are a number of people in civil society who care and they can see that number, that's going to have a big influence. So money, votes, and people, and individuals. I think in my experience, all of the different campaigns that I've run and all of the different change that I've seen, a lot of it comes down to those three. In this particular case, we decided to follow the money. And what we did is we looked to see where the products were going. 80% of everything Canada logged was going to international markets, the majority of it to the United States. And we started looking for customers and talking to those customers and then coordinating campaigns specifically against customers like Home Depot or Staples. Victoria's Secret catalogs at the time were made from Canadian old growth forests. And it was developing that market pressure, that boycott campaign that led to the first victories in British Columbia. Macmillan Bloedel halting logging in 1997 in Clayoquot Sound, and eventually working with the Nuu-chah-nulth people to create a joint project where Nuu-chah-nulth had majority control through their own company, Ipcc Forestry, as well as conservation planning. But that campaign took a whole bunch of years. And at the same time, what I realized is that so much of the world's forests were disappearing and so quickly. So this is a map from the World Resources Institute back from 1996, I think, showing the state of the world's forests, large areas that are large enough to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem services. This is the original extent of what they called frontier forests. And back in 1996, this was what was left. And so the majority still today of the world's remaining intact forests are in Canada, Russia, and Brazil. Canada was logging our forests extremely quickly. And I realized at that point that Clayoquot Sound was just the tip of the iceberg. On British Columbia's west coast, the majority of our intact forest was in this area, now called the Great Bear Rainforest, even on the maps as a result of our campaign. When I first started working on it, the region was only known on the maps as the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area, an area where many Indigenous communities live. There are very few roads, only airplane and boat access, and it was being logged at incredible rates. We continued our markets efforts and our boycott efforts, and eventually that led the majority of the companies to the table, and the first joint agreement between environmental groups and industry in the country that led to a moratorium and eventually the permanent protection of over 5 million hectares of the Great Rainforest. Now I'm running through that story just to give you an example of a campaign and a story that was successful, and how we did the analysis and what led me to the work that I'm doing now. But of course, even this many years later, it's not over. There is still controversy today. Some of you may have seen the Globe and Mail article that I was quoted in earlier this summer. In the areas that are still open to logging on the coast, it's supposed to be ecosystem-based management, but we're seeing a high grading of what's the few remaining old growth cedars, and there's still more work to be done in developing ecosystem-based management and conservation planning outside of the intact areas on the coast. So it's really over, but we were able to protect a considerable amount right around the time so about 11 years in, 12 years in to my work on forestry and conservation, I came across this map. And this map at the time was showing us the extent of pine beetle damage in British Columbia's forests. And then I started reading global reports of not only insect infestations, but also fires across the world's primary forests. And it was that, for me, was my climate reckoning moment. I think people come to an understanding of climate change in different ways, depending on how it impacts you and what touches you and your lives. For me, it was understanding that industrial logging was no longer the greatest threat to the world's remaining forests. Of course, it's still a threat, but in fact, the greatest threat to all of our ecosystems and our own health is now climate change. And it's funny, up until that point, although I'd been reading reports about climate change, it was something that other people dealt with. I was really glad they were, and that other people worked on energy systems, but I worked on forestry. And that map, and right around 2007 was when I realized that I don't think any of us have that luxury anymore of just hoping that someone else is addressing it. And so I stopped all of my work on forestry and conservation and the trade of wood and paper products that year. And I started working entirely on climate change. And so it's been now about 13 years that I've worked almost entirely on oil and gas and fossil fuels and climate change. And I want to share with you a little bit about what I found out, what I know, and what I'm working on now. So I think probably most people on this webinar know that climate change is now the biggest threat facing humanity. That more people lose their homes as a result of climate change than war. We know, it's now reported, that we've experienced a dramatic increase in refugees around the world. It's now upwards of between 65 million and 100 million a year, and we're not dealing with it well. Yet the projections are even worse. Climate change and related impacts will be one of the primary reasons for the increase in refugees around the world. And the most commonly cited yet very conservative estimate is that we will see at least 200 million people who are considered climate migrants by 2050, according to the International Organization for Migration. This year, UN representatives told the Security Council that water scarcity produced by climate change was driving a cycle of conflict in developing countries, and simultaneously that by 2050, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates food production will plummet in Europe, many parts of Asia, and almost all of Africa by at least 50%, 35 to 50%. And of course, food costs globally are expected to and have already started to skyrocket. This year, UN agencies told us that droughts and floods have reversed progress on global hunger and driven food shortages and malnutrition to 10-year highs. Around the world, harvest levels are falling and prices of basic necessities like grain are skyrocketing. There's a lot of ways we can talk about climate change. There's so many statistics, we could just spend an entire hour just on that. But the reason I brought those particular ones on migrants and food to the forefront and conflict is because climate change is not an environmental issue. I think, and this is one of these meta moments, that people learn by stories, not by stats. And one story that I can share with you, another kind of moment of reckoning for me, on my way to the UN climate change negotiations in Bali, I happened to be sitting on the plane beside the chief negotiator for Liberia. Just happened. And we started chatting. And he asked me about what was happening in our country. And I told him about the expansion of the oil sands and the debates over wind farms in Ontario and carbon tax debates. And he looked at me with this very sad look, and I'll never forget it. And he said, "That's so nice. That's so nice that you still have time for those debates, because in my country, people are dying every day as a result of climate change." And, you know, he didn't seem as much a negotiator as he did kind of a mourner. And it was in that moment that I realized that these are not environmental issues anymore. These are the moral challenge of our age. These are human rights issues. These are economic issues. These are social justice issues. And that, for me, kind of that awareness really changed everything. Because what we know about climate change and the impacts is that they're not affecting people equally. They're affecting people disproportionately, especially people who are marginalized communities, especially people who are predominantly non-white communities, especially people in the global south. So by 2050, at current rates of emissions, the biggest cities in the Middle East and Southeast Asia will have become lethally hot. There would be, by 2050, at current rates of emissions, there will be ice-free summers in the Arctic and unstoppable disintegration of the West Antarctic's ice sheet. So what that means is that the world's coastal cities will be underwater or threatened with inundation. Millions will be forced to flee. Coral reefs, of course, will mostly disappear, like they have begun to already. And people around the world will be fleeing extreme heat and fires even more than what they are today. So why is it happening? It's happening, of course, because global emissions have increased 70% since 1970. And in the same time period, we've seen over a 50% increase in the severity and frequency of violent storms on the planet. And the planet has only warmed 1 degree. So if the average temperature stabilizes between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees, as we saw through the analysis of the IPCC report last year, then we can expect up to 2 billion people to face water shortages, up to 30% of plant and animal species to face extinction. Already today, we know that our oceans are already 30% more acidic than they were in the 1950s. And NOAA tells us that at 6%, at 6 degrees, which is 4 to 6 degrees is our current trajectory, the oceans will be 150% more acidic. So I don't need to go through more. I think many of you know the impacts we're facing. If any of this is a surprise to you, I encourage you to just download the summary of the IPCC report. This is a report that was written by 91 leading scientists from 40 countries. Together, they examined 6,000 studies. The report was then signed off on by 140 countries, including our own. The idea of getting that kind of consensus means that it's a very conservative report. And this very conservative report tells us that we have about 11 years to avoid catastrophe, that staying at 1.5 degrees requires slashing global greenhouse gas emissions 45% below 2010 levels by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. Those sound like just numbers. Sometimes they're hard to really take in. But what it really means is that right now, every ton of carbon matters. So the idea that China and India are a bigger problem and what Canada does really matter, but doesn't matter, or whether or not you take that flight doesn't really matter because these other sectors are growing emissions quicker. All of it right now matters. Every ton of carbon that we save going into the atmosphere today saves lives. That's the bottom line. And what the IPCC showed us is that every industry, and every country needs to bend the curve now. We have some experience now of bending the curve as a result of our shared lived experience of the pandemic. We know what successful response to the pandemic looks like. It means listening to the science, and it means acting early, neither of which we've been doing on climate change. So how are we doing right now? So this chart shows you basically the ambition gap globally between current policies, which add up to about, with pledges, 2.6 to 3.2 degrees. And remember, the quite terrifying statistics from the Ipcc I shared with you are if we stabilize temperatures between 1.5 and 2.5. So current policies globally add up to between 3.1 and 3.7 degrees temperature rise. Our current trajectory is somewhere closer to between 4.1 and 4.8 degrees. That's how well we're doing globally. For context for Canada, because I'm going to move into a conversation about our own challenge, we need to understand that even conservative bodies like the IEA or Mark Carney, the Governor of Bank of England, have acknowledged that if we are going to be successful in stabilizing emissions anywhere to around 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, that means 2/3 of our fossil fuel reserves are unburnable and need to stay in the ground. And that essentially is the great disconnect in Canada. We have an incredibly strong now, I would say quite strong, and certainly better than we've ever had, climate framework nationally. The Pan-Canadian Climate Framework has moved us quite significantly on climate policy with a carbon price across the country, as well as many, many other initiatives that are extremely good. But unfortunately, all the progress that we're making in the electricity sector, in buildings, in phasing out coal, in the carbon price, is being offset by our growth in our two top emitting sectors, transportation and oil and gas. So emissions from the production of oil and gas in Canada are now the fastest growing source of emissions and the largest source of emissions. The majority of emissions from oil and gas come from where you burn it. So 80% of the emissions from oil and gas come out from the oil and gas that we develop in Canada happen outside of the country because we export it. But even just production emissions from oil and gas make oil and gas emissions in Canada the largest and fastest growing source of emissions. So what's interesting about that is, other than the methane rules that we have, the majority of our policies in the country don't address growing emissions from oil and gas at all. And I think most people just really don't realize that. The Ipcc report says that if we're to have a chance of not exceeding 1.5 degrees, we need to decrease emissions from oil and gas 37% by 2040. So keep that in mind while I show you the trajectory that we're on in Canada. So in Canada, there's our emissions in blue. There's the emissions from oil and gas, or from oil sands as their own. With current projections using government and industry data, our emissions will go down between now and 2030 and 2050. But oil and gas emissions are not projected to go down. In fact, they're projected to increase still a little bit. That doesn't mean that the industry is not putting in place new technologies to reduce emissions per barrel, because they are. But if we allow production to increase, even if we're reducing emissions per barrel, emissions intensity, and becoming more efficient, our emissions don't go down enough for us to do our fair share. Even these targets are not our fair share and have been criticized around the world for being too weak. In fact, the Trudeau government's targets are Harper's targets, which Trudeau criticized prior to coming into power. So if we take a look at this bar chart, this is really what it means. Oil and gas is responsible for 183 million tons of Canada's 722 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So oil and gas emissions are expected to grow to 215 million tons by 2030. Canada says emissions by 2030 have to be at 583 million tons. So what that means is emissions just from the production of oil and gas will be 40% of Canada's emissions by 2030. 40% of Canada's emissions by 2030. That actually doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make economic sense, and that means we're going to have to squeeze emissions reductions out of every other sector and province in order to allow the pollution to rise from oil and gas. The easiest reductions, the low-hanging fruit, have already been accounted for in the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework. So that means the growth from oil and gas would have to pursue expensive and hard to achieve reductions from individuals and other sectors. So that's a critical context for Canada, and for me, kind of like the great disconnect that I have been focusing on. As far as I can understand it today, the idea in how to meet the gap in the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework, and even in British Columbia for the climate framework, is to plant more trees, to buy credits, and to subsidize the oil and gas industry to come up with new technologies. I don't think the new technologies, carbon capture and storage, et cetera, are necessarily wrong. In fact, if we're going to get to net zero, we need them all. But we need them on existing production while that production declines. The really big issue in this country is whether or not we should be expanding, and I believe globally, whether or not we should be expanding fossil fuel production, oil, gas, and coal. And the industry is trying to hide the idea of that expansion is okay by saying that they're addressing it through technological innovation. But the technological innovations, if you look at the numbers, cannot reduce emissions fast enough to allow production to continue to increase. Production in the oil sands and in all of the oil and gas sectors across Canada must decline in order for us to meet our targets and to do our fair share. And it's critical that every country do their fair share, because this is a global problem, especially because there are equity issues at stake with what we're seeing happen in the global south. Now, this chart is a little confusing, but I wanted to be clear that it's not just about the oil sands, because we're seeing a dramatic rise in natural gas development. I hate the fact that it's even called natural, in fracking and LNG in British Columbia, as well as in Alberta. So British Columbia, I think, has a very strong climate plan. Again, we have a problem in British Columbia in that the recently approved projects like PNW, LNG, would take up so much space that by 2050, they take up all the space of emissions that were allowed in the entire province. So this is not a problem that's just simply a Canadian problem. In fact, what we know when we add up every single project, which I've done, I co-founded the Global Gas and Oil Network. We spent literally hundreds of thousands of dollars doing a global analysis last year. Using the Rystad database, we added up every single oil and gas project that has been approved and has CapEx in. What we found out in that analysis is that we already have enough oil, gas, and coal under construction and production to take the world to 2 degrees. Any new projects, whether that be Trans Mountain or Tech Frontier or LNG or any of the new fossil fuel projects, we can't afford to safely burn. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why are we spending money, political capital, financial capital, intellectual capital, to dig up more oil, gas, and coal than the world can safely burn? What we also found out is that 85% of the planned production expansion of oil and gas globally is in North America. So 4 subnationals, Texas, New Mexico, Alberta, and British Columbia, are responsible for the global expansion of 85% of oil and gas globally. And so when people say Canada is just a small player and we're not important, what we're important for is whether or not we're locking in a fossil fuel future in the expansion of fossil fuels, or whether we're not. So again, a little picture of the global picture. Investment in 2018, it's obviously, these are the most recent statistics we can get a full analysis for, but I should have 2019 within the next month. But what we're seeing is that still investment in billions of dollars, global investment for oil and gas far exceeds renewables or energy efficiency. Okay, but it's not all bad news. The fact is that the world is starting to move on. Countries are starting to move on. We now have countries banning fossil fuel cars, many of them setting dates for that. We've seen the prices of solar and batteries and wind drop. So this should mean actually that less fossil fuels are being developed if we rely on the markets. The point is we can't just rely on the markets. Fossil fuels are 80% of the climate problem. In fact, they are now a global security threat, and governments are responsible for the public good. If we just rely, if the markets alone were addressing the climate problem, it actually might work. But the fact is what we're now seeing is that governments are subsidizing bad projects and fossil fuel projects that would have gone out of business, like Trans Mountain. We've seen it here in Canada. The federal government buying Trans Mountain kept that project alive. Investors had already pulled out. So what we need to do is we need to ensure that we have a decline, a planned decline with a just transition for workers of existing fossil fuel production while the new solutions and investment comes forward. And as I've said, we have already seen dramatic changes happening around the world. Most of the trends are in the right direction, except for political spending, except for government spending and government policy, because governments are still so heavily influenced by fossil fuel incumbents. I'm going to run through these fairly quickly because I see that we're running out of time and I want to wrap up. But the trends that I really wanted to refer to is the fact that we're seeing breakthroughs in technology. We're seeing massive divestment around the world, trillions of dollars. And in fact, the majority of leaders would agree around the world, economists who are speaking out, and analysts, and even now the IMF and World Bank, that most economies will move to a low carbon economy eventually. Canada's economy will move to a low carbon economy eventually. The question is, how painful will it be? How much do we plan for it? And how quickly? So right now what we're seeing is that oil production in Canada has been going up over the past decade, while royalties are going down, taxes are going down, and employment is going down. So we're told that this is an industry that is essential to our economy. It's actually essential to the profit margins of these companies, the majority of which profits leave the country. Yes, it's going to be difficult to transform our economy, but it's essential. And the sooner we take this seriously and create a just transition, not just for coal, but oil and gas, the better. Okay, so now that we know all that, what do? I threw this slide in here because when I first started doing this work, I really thought that it was about education. It was about providing this information, and that would change how the world sees this work and what would happen. And what I realized is that good campaigning, the work of social change, is not just about education, it's about motivation. It's about motivating people to action. So of course you do need a foundation of knowledge and the truth and the facts, but that's not actually what's going to result in social change. What gets us to a desired state from a current state is creating a critical pathway that's informed by who can make the changes we want to see in the world, and how we reach them and how we influence them. I'm going to bump over a couple of these examples in campaigns and just maybe do one for time's sake. So I want to give you one example of a successful campaign that I designed that I think really changed a lot of things. And it's just coming back outside of Canada, just to get a little bit of perspective. So the problem we were looking at was the fact that the IT sector was the fastest growing consumer of electricity. And that's for, you know, Facebook and Twitter and Google and all those videos and have to be stored somewhere. So Facebook and other companies were building new data centers, which were creating a huge new demand for electricity, and new coal plants were being built for these companies. And these are companies that think they're progressive, but they were fueling a whole new generation of coal plants around the world. So we decided two things. We knew that Facebook could actually change its policy around what kind of renewable energy it wanted to produce. Ultimately, we wanted to get governments to not build coal plants, but to build renewable energy. But we realized that Facebook as a customer could have a huge influence on them. So then we did the power mapping to try and think, well, how can we influence Facebook? Well, part of influencing Facebook, we realized, was about influencing Facebook employees, because the biggest vulnerability in the IT sector is employee retention, because they all compete for them. So we designed a campaign that really got to the employees, to really talking about who Facebook was and what it could become. And just for maybe humor and also levity, I'm going to share with you a little video that I helped create for this campaign, which was ultimately successful. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear the video when I play it? Okay, let me just see if I know how to do this. Nope, not going to do it because I probably don't know how to do it then with everyone. Okay, I'll explain the campaign then. That'll be easier. So what we did is we launched a campaign against Facebook on Facebook, and encouraged people around the world to join us in talking to Facebook employees and trying to get them to see that Facebook could stop demanding coal, could actually start demanding renewable energy. And it was based with a tone around how much we loved Facebook, but we just wished they were green. So tone is very important when you're trying to figure out how to engage with a decision maker. We also realized because the companies compete, if we graded them all, we would create peer pressure between the companies. To make a several years story short, Facebook became the first company in the world to create a procurement policy for renewable energy. They were quickly followed then by Apple and Microsoft and Twitter and many of the others. And the result is that we helped to ensure that many new coal plants were not built around the world. And that campaign also engaged a whole generation of millennials who didn't quite know how they could do anything on climate change. And I think that's really important, is what can we do? The Harper government was famous for saying that these pipelines across the country are nation building. I think they have been. I think they've been building a kind of nation, and in fact, an international movement of resistance. So the climate campaigns that I started working on when I moved back to Canada after doing a bunch of these international campaigns was specifically on pipelines, because I realized they made the issue more tangible. And if we could build coalitions with different organizations, scientists, Indigenous peoples, doctors, teachers, that we would be stronger. The result of the pipeline campaigns, as I'm sure you've all lived with, is that every single pipeline that has been proposed from the oil sands in the last 8 years, we've been able to either delay or stop. So far, except for Trans Mountain, which is a campaign that I'm still working on. It's only 6% built, so that's not over. But the point is that we were able to develop an analysis and organize together, because together we are stronger. We are greater than the sum of our parts. So I also think that the pipeline campaigns had a significant impact in getting us the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework and the Alberta Climate Plan. Unfortunately, Premier Kenney has been rolling that back. So to conclude, what I realized, though, after many, many years of working on oil sands and pipelines in Canada, was that Canada was not alone with this challenge. Exactly what we're going through, colleagues of mine are experiencing in Norway, in Argentina, in Ecuador. Every country and every company wants to believe that their fossil fuel production is okay, that it fits. But the fact is, it doesn't. None of it does. And in fact, this chart is from the World Economic Forum. It used to be that weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, were considered the most likely and most impactful threat to humanity. Today, climate action and the failure to mitigate climate change is the most likely and strongest impact on global security. We, in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, believe that part of what we need to do is help people to understand that fossil fuels and constraining fossil fuels is a part of our security. It's no longer a part of our prosperity, the expansion of fossil fuels. Last year, the UN and Stockholm Environment Institute produced the Production Gap Report, the first ever analysis showing that we have 120% more fossil fuels currently planned than can be burned in a 2-degree pathway. But part of my own journey in understanding that, I went back to the Paris Accord to try and understand what the international agreements we currently have do to constrain the expansion of fossil fuels. I shockingly found out that not even the words fossil fuels, oil, gas, or coal are included in the entire Paris Agreement. That we have actually created an analysis globally and an approach to climate change that makes fossil fuels invisible, in large part as a result of the influence and power and lobby of the fossil fuel industry. We're doing a lot to try and constrain emissions. We're doing quite a bit to change technologies and to fund new technologies and to even put a price on carbon in many places around the world. But what we're not doing is stopping the expansion. The risks of delay in stopping the expansion is that it makes the transition harder. It creates stranded assets and financial turmoil. It, of course, increases dramatic risks to workers and communities. It delays the expansion of renewable energy. So it's with that logic that a group of academics and diplomats and advocates from around the world have come together in a project that I chair called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This fall at Climate Week, we will for the first time really publicly propose that the world needs a new treaty, a fossil fuel treaty in combination with the Paris Accord, not to replace the Paris Accord, but as a complement to the Paris Accord. Just like with nuclear non-proliferation when I was growing up in the 70s, we need an agreement globally to stop the expansion, and no one country can do it on its own. And so stopping the expansion and then figuring out how to create a global just transition is the work of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. We now have a global initiative that includes a campaign with youth groups from multiple countries around the world that will launch in late 2020, a research agenda with academics from around the world, and starting to develop regional partners and subnational and city governments who are supportive of the idea and working together to figure out the principles of the treaty and eventually in the coming year draft a treaty. We think it will have tremendous impacts, including a normative shift in the climate policy debate globally. So I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with the group so that anyone has access to all of these slides. I've thrown in some lessons learned around how to develop analysis and roadmaps for social change. And I will just leave you with this one thought, which is that when I first started this work, I didn't even have a computer. I'm not that old, and there wasn't internet. My first campaign was run by fax. We didn't have cell phones. In fact, in the second year of the Clackwood campaign, Greenpeace bought me a cell phone. It was the size of a brick, and it required its own briefcase. The world can change so quickly. The world is changing so quickly. And I don't think I would have ever believed 20, 30 years ago the way that today we can communicate, how information is at our fingertips, the ability to organize with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people is at our fingertips. We're living in actually an incredibly exciting time where we are reimagining industrial society. We have the capacity, the technology, the information to change the world in the time frame that we have. But it requires all of us to engage, not just to read the information and know the stats, but to figure out how we spend our time and how we talk about these issues and what we do. And that's why I'm so glad that you've included this conversation in your webinar series. Thank you. Whew, okay, 45 minutes. Did I make it? Somewhere close. I wanted to now move to setting up, I hope, what will be an awesome discussion. Give me a thumbs up if I've stopped sharing my screen. Yes, awesome, great. Okay, it's hard to do 30 years in 45 minutes and then move over to setting up breakout rooms, but I'm going to do it. Okay. We're going to move, there's going to be some kind of webinar magic, and someone's going to put us into cool breakout rooms. And I thought what might be useful to start the conversation, and then we'll come back all together and we'll have a Q&A. But for the breakout rooms initially, I thought it would be good first for everybody just to take a minute or two and write down questions they have so they don't lose them, because we're going to come back to the Q&A. And then the question that we framed, I think someone has it on the screen, they're going to put up for you, but the question that we framed for the discussion, which will only be 10 minutes, I think, in the breakout room, is these issues, especially in these challenging times, can be overwhelming. The disconnect between rhetoric and action can make us feel despair. So what gives you hope? Seemed like a good gift to each other to have a little bit of that conversation before we go into the Q&A. So with that, I will hand it over to the people who do the magic to get us into the breakout rooms, and I will see you during the Q&A.
Alrighty, I'm pretty sure that's everyone back here. Awesome. Okay. I hope everyone had good discussions going on in their little breakout rooms. I guess right now, if anyone wanted to share their responses, so what gives them hope, if you want to type in the chat that you'd like to share, and then I can call upon you. I know for me, what I was talking about was just large public displays of action. So things like climate strikes and things like that, that's what was giving me hope. So does anyone want to share? Want to go straight back to the Q&A? We can do that as well. Just let me know. I'll give it maybe a few more seconds. If not,
there is some Lynn Adams with Climate Fast. The Fridays for Future Global Climate Strike next date will be September 25th. So that's a date, and the whole week, Climate Week, is open for events to happen. So
definitely, yeah, those are awesome. I find, for me at least, just being around like-minded people and having everyone there doing the same work, it's awesome. Anyone else want to share sort of what they were talking about in the discussion groups, the breakout rooms? Anyone else?
In our discussion, we were talking about wanting to do more with strategies. So we got a little bit of a sense of some of the things that affect levers of power, but if we could do a bigger discussion on that, maybe even a part 2 with Tzeporah, because she's so good. So good to hear from that experience. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good idea. That's awesome. Yeah, anyone else want to maybe share? Let me know.
Yeah, I can share something.
Yeah, awesome.
So I work for an environmental NGO, but I'm here on behalf of the group I volunteer for, called Carbon Conversations Toronto. And one of the things that gives me hope is basically the connections with like-minded people and the ability for me to interact and communicate with them and work with them on real solutions through volunteering and through my work as well. Just knowing that there are people out there who are thinking like I am, it does give me that hope, and it also keeps me accountable, and it keeps me kind of motivated to continue. So
yeah, definitely. I think that was great, just thinking about the other side of it, of accountability. Like, that's awesome. Yeah, anyone else have anything they would like to share? I'm just gonna look around, see if anyone's unmuting themselves. If not, we can go straight. Oh, yes.
Oh,
yeah.
good. Sorry about that. This is a new concept to me, going off into separate rooms and coming back. My name is Vinny. I'm sure you can see that on the display. I was speaking to another person, Brian, in our room, and we both happen to have a background in IT, and we were discussing lithium-ion batteries as well as hydrogen fuel cells. And one of the interesting things that we sort of came to a mutual agreement on was how there is no returning back to normal, irrespective of what fuel we use for our motor vehicles or even aircraft. Lithium ion is probably not the solution when we upsize it to large vehicles. We just don't have enough of that resource. And the change to hydrogen seems to have been suppressed for decades, if not since the beginning of the space age. We also happen to discuss the Hindenburg and other things that have caused people to fear hydrogen, even though it's less dangerous than gasoline fumes, and it catches fire no harder, or no easier and no harder. Yeah, that's about my point. It's just our concerns about new fuels and government lobbying and such. Thank you.
Definitely. That's awesome. Navigating through all that stuff. Good stuff. Anyone else? If not, just unmute and share your thoughts. Yeah.
Okay, it's Lynn, and I just wanted to say that Climate Fast is doing a lot of work on webcasts and looking at solutions. And we welcome people to join our email list. You can do that by clicking on climatefast.ca. And we love new volunteers as well. So I think Tzeporah was saying action is the antidote to despair. And so we provide lots of opportunities for that. Thank you.
Awesome. No, that was awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing. Those were really great points and thoughts, and sharing those resources as well in the chat. I can see those are amazing if everyone wants to take a look. I think right now we're going to move on to the Q&A. So Tanhum and Claudia, if you want to explain how that's going to work, we can do that now.
So just like, I guess, just like the discussion, you can type question into the chat, and then Tanhum will call you up to ask your question. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can type your question into the chat, but it's nicer to hear everyone's voice. Yeah. And keep your question and follow-up to just one question and one follow-up so that other people can join in too. Tanhum.
All right, thank you so much for segueing us into that. Just to get us, well, first of all, thank you all for sticking around. I know that we've sort of whittled down the number of participants here, but that maybe that we'll turn this into more of an intimate conversation. Just to get us started off, I have my own question, but I want to read one that was given to us right at the beginning, so that and I think it's an important one. So we'll start off with that, and then I'll start to move through the chat. So this one was given to us by Cynthia Minden, who unfortunately had to leave right after Tzeporah stopped speaking. So her question is, how effective is signing online petitions and pre-written letters? I get many of these via email every day, but I imagine they get ignored by politicians. I started a pop-up letter writing cafe here last year. It was an action that people felt connected to, something they could easily participate in. We provided talking points, and people wrote written letters in their own words about a specific issue that we selected. The pandemic has, of course, put an end to this. So the question is how effective they are.
I would say effective to varying degrees, and I'll explain that, and also critical. So, there are so many issues facing our elected leaders, especially today with the pandemic, and they will work on the stuff that shuffles to the top. And it shuffles to the top because it's in the news and they have to respond because of a reputational capital issue, or it's big news, or because they know that their constituents care about it. So their staff will add up how many letters they get, how many petitions they get, how many calls they get on a particular issue. And that will help decide the agenda of decision makers. If they're getting a kind of click here petition, it's weighted less. They actually have a weighting system, which I don't know off the top of my head, but so if they get a a petition signature, it's weighted less than a letter. If they get a form letter through a campaign, it's weighted less than a handwritten letter. So the person who asked the question was right. Handwritten letters or actual calls to your MLA or MPs are going to be the most impactful pieces, but the other pieces are important as well. If the organizations who are doing the petitions and the letter writing campaigns are doing their job well, they will be aggregating those numbers and communicating those numbers in multiple ways. So for example, what our campaigns do at Stand.Earth is if we do a petition and we get 50,000 people to sign on to an issue. First of all, we're going to ask for postal codes. And the reason we do that is so that we can map where those people are. That matters. If you go in to meet with a member of parliament and you say, we have 3,000 people who we're in communication with who have signed this petition, who are waiting to hear how you respond on this issue. Well, they may have won that riding by less than 1,000 votes. 3,000 people matter to them at that point. Or we can go into the Prime Minister's office and say, here's 50,000 people who matter. We deliver the petitions directly to the politicians in whatever form we can, to their offices, etc. We let the media know the aggregate number. So all of these things actually matter in a campaign. And what is really important now for organizing is when people sign a petition, they get your email or they get your phone number or they get all of your information. That's really critical because the news media is so weak these days. It's so consolidated. So for organizations like my own, Stand, to be able to have direct communication with all of you through email or through your cell phone, that's absolutely critical because we can't rely on mainstream media anymore to cover the issues in a way that keep you updated and engaged. And so list building and direct communication is really critical, because ultimately it's about being greater than the sum of our parts and acting together at key moments. And what you should depend on the organizations you trust for, whoever that is, it's Greenpeace, it's Sierra Club, it's Lead Now, Dogwood, any of these organizations, Environmental Defense or Ecoterre, these organizations are trying to figure out what the key moments are and to let you know. The Tech Frontier campaign is a really good example. We saw that looming, that huge oil sands facility. We organized all of us around the country to let Canadians know and give Canadians a way to engage on that issue. And ultimately, it's why the cabinet was having so much trouble approving it and why Tech pulled out, because they knew that they weren't going to get the clear approvals that they wanted because there was too much opposition from Canadians.
Okay, great. I have a couple of questions that have popped up on the chat. I see that there's a few comments, so I'm going to gloss over them unless their author is wants to make themselves known that they want to actually ask a question. I invite Tom Cullen to unmute and ask your question. I see you've unmuted. Go for it.
Hi, Tzeporah. Thanks so much for the great talk. My question was, I agreed with you certainly that tone is important, and I'll admit that sometimes my tone is not as respectful about some of the players. But the question is that the whole oil and gas sector, we're trying to encourage or need them to stop expanding. But that's contrary to their entire core business model, which is typically to always replace whatever the reserves that have been consumed or in production, to replace them every year. Although I note there are a couple of contrary examples, like BP writing off some assets. How do we convince that whole sector that their time is nigh and they need to change their business model?
Oh, just a softball, huh, Tom? I don't think we do. I don't think you can convince a company that they have to go to business. And we're not going to be able to convince a company that we have a better business model for them. Some companies are already seeing the writing on the wall. You mentioned BP. I think their recent announcement is a huge step towards this. I would say Repsol is probably even better. There are many oil and gas companies now that are writing down assets for the first time really in history, because their economic model is based on growth, and their financial worth is actually based on growth. The reserve ratio replacement value, how much they can say they have in reserve that they're going to access, is how they're valued. And so it's not in oil and gas incumbents' best interest to say, we're not going to access this, or we have less to access. They only do that in crisis. And that's what's starting to happen with companies. Some companies are in a better position to diversify their portfolios into renewables, but it's hard for oil and gas companies to diversify into renewables because they're not structured properly. Renewables by their nature are decentralized, they're diversified, they're distributed, and it's power held in the hands of many instead of a few, which is in part why they're such a great solution. Because this is not just about how we produce energy, but also who produces energy, who controls it, how many of us, and whether more people have access to controlling the energy they need. And that's why the big fossil fuel incumbents have been fighting renewables so hard for so long, because no one owns the sun and the wind, and it can be a more diversified system. That means that profits are less concentrated. It also means, because they actually produce a product and then energy is produced elsewhere, they're not utilities. They're not set up to actually produce electricity. So they have their own infrastructure. Oil and gas companies, however, in Canada, probably, especially pipeline companies, have an opportunity to diversify into geothermal and other industries. But really, I think the larger issue around tone and oil and gas decline is around who can do it. I don't think the big Canadian companies are going to see the light. And they're going to, this is the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. They're going to try and get in as much infrastructure and new projects as they can to make money, because they can see the writing on the wall and they know that the world is shifting. The big question for them is who gets to produce while production is still allowed, and how much. And they're all competing to get access to those last new fossil fuel projects while the world moves to a more electrified and renewable economy. And that's why I think it's up to governments to regulate production, which is not something that has been done very well in the past. We look at it project by project. We don't look at it in a cumulative way. Our policies for project approval are not aligned with our climate policies. Neither are California's, neither are Norway's. That's part of what I've been trying to get at through the Fossil Fuel Treaty. But I think part of what we need to do is to start making clear that the health of oil companies is not the same as the health of Alberta. And that's what I was trying to do with that last slide, because oil companies continue to make some of the highest profits in the world. Even while some of them are going bankrupt and going under, they're still managing to siphon off money for their profit margins, but they're doing that by giving the people less money. So less royalties, less taxes, less jobs, more cheaper production, and more profit and higher profit margins. And so it's up to governments to actually regulate, and we need to try and create a conversation where people see that what benefits the oil companies is not benefiting Canadians. I think that's happening. I think we have a very new conversation in the last 3 years in Canada on liabilities. The fact that these companies are creating a massive toxic mess that is now assessed to be in the billions of dollars and not paying for the cleanup. That's the beginning of people saying, well, wait, hey, this isn't fair. And change is, and engagement is actually made based on values, not by stats. So recognizing that there's a fairness problem is really critical to getting more people engaged and taking action. And finally, on tone, I will say that I had my aha moment a bunch of years ago when I was working in Alberta, and I realized I was making more enemies than friends. And I was doing a speech in Calgary and one in Fort McMurray, and everyone told me I was crazy and I shouldn't. And I decided to start it by talking about how much the world has changed and trying to create a common purpose. And so what I said is, we've all benefited from the fossil fuel economy. Hey, I flew here on a plane. We are all still benefiting from the fossil fuel economy, and certainly Canada's economy has. And the fact is, we didn't know what we know today. We didn't know about the impacts of oil and gas development on climate change. We didn't know that the cumulative impacts of all of this development would mean 300 million liters of toxic water a day being pumped into toxic sludge ponds. We didn't know. We didn't know the impact on our air or our water. Now we know. So what are we going to do about it together? How do we shift to building cleaner systems and making sure we have clean jobs and leaving no one behind? And it was like you could hear a pin drop in the room, especially in Fort McMurray. And afterwards, I had a lineup of people waiting to talk to me who were all oil workers or teachers, a lot of teachers. And they, you know, many were in tears. No one's ever talked to us like that. Everyone said we're the enemy. You know, I got a job in the oilsands because I didn't have any other options. There weren't renewable energy jobs. If there were, I would have got one. And it was all of a sudden people were thinking collectively and feeling less attacked. And so I think this question of creating a common purpose and creating a tone that creates a common purpose is really important. And distinguishing the companies, the Exxons of the world, from the workers and the people who are impacted by the industry. I think that's absolutely critical. I don't want to have common cause with Exxon, in fact, because I've seen the impact that they're having and the doubt and denial that they have been funding for years. But I want to have common cause with all of those workers, because honestly, if we are really going to make the transition in time for our kids' future, it requires all hands on deck. We need all those engineers and all of those people working in the energy sector to shift. And we need people in industry to shift. And so in order to do that, we have to have common cause.
So I'm actually going to take the opportunity as the moderator to throw my question in there right now, because it really touches upon some of the things that you just said, and it just flows nicely. You said you had your aha moment, and it shifted you from thinking about these, or some of these issues at least, as environmental issues, to climate change being very people oriented and much broader than how we normally conceive of just the environment. And I'm wondering if that aha moment also triggered a shift in the use of language for you, from perhaps a technocratic type of language focusing on, you know, this is acid rain, this is the impact, these are the numbers, the gigatons, etc., to using more moral language in how you campaign and how you speak to people in government and companies?
It did. I think I'm still, I fall back still without realizing it on statistics and numbers. And you have to have some of that. But I think it's something that the climate movement has done wrong for so long, because those numbers are very far away from us. You know, it's a very, very small percentage of the world that is moved by the fact that, you know, we need to get to 80% blah, 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 blah. And our, you know, and there's some of us that are, I don't know, wired that way. Maybe we're more academic by nature or policy wonks that we can really go there. And what's interesting is that my experience of kind of the conservation movement and forest work was that it was a movement of people that was built from the ground up. It was very grassroots, and it stemmed from a love, like a love of these forests. And sure, there's science behind it. There were a lot of scientists behind it as well. But we communicated our passion in our work. We stood in front of those forests and talked about, how these trees were 800 years old and et cetera. And the climate movement for decades talked about carbon tax versus cap and dividend and 80% by blah, blah, blah. And, who had this percentage of emissions reductions. And it allowed us all to think about it as something else and something out there. And then the industry, if you read industry papers, PR papers from way back, the 70s and 80s, they loved that because it took them out of it. And they encouraged governments to create things like the 1 ton challenge. Anybody remember that? Canada poured money into the 1 ton challenge. Make it individuals' responsibility. Sell it individually. We should all put on a sweater, do our 0, hour once a year, and start walking to work. And then it became everyone's responsibility and therefore nobody's responsibility. And that's what I see when I look at the history of the climate movement. And where I see it going now is that there are more tangible projects with tangible timelines that people are fighting, so people can see it. That's really good. But I think that we still don't talk enough about fairness, about values, and about things that are actually going to trigger people. Marshall Gant says in any communication strategy, you need to have a challenge, a choice, and an opportunity. Marshall Gantz's information and playbooks are all available free online. And if you're interested in social change and running campaigns and communications theory, he's kind of the guru. He taught Obama. But he does, there's 2 things that I always remember whenever I'm designing anything around a campaign, which is putting yourself in the story in order to connect and create common purpose. So he has a whole framework around learning to speak around the story of me, the story of us, and the story of now. You'll note, if you think back to my 45 or hour long talk, I did that. And then he also talks about making sure if you want to motivate people, you have to have the challenge, the choice, and the opportunity. It can't just be the issue. Here's the problem, here's the solution. It has to be the challenge, the choice, and the opportunity, because you're not just giving information, you're trying to motivate people. And so I use those 2 frameworks when I design communications work now. I don't know if I answered your question. I might need more coffee, I'm rambling.
That was great. Thank you. And I see that Lynn Adamson here has posted a link to Marshall Gantz's website. I'd like to give Laura L. the opportunity to unmute and ask their questions. Laura L. Excellent.
Hey there. First of all, thank you so much for an absolutely outstanding presentation. I want to take it in once, twice, 3 times. It might take me 10 times. But congratulations on all of your awesome work. I think if I had seen the same pictures that you talked about with the old growth forests, I would have changed careers at that point in my life as well. But it continues to shock me that these types of stories and situations and campaigns aren't front page news all the time. How can we get these types of issues that have real stories, real people being impacted, et cetera, front page national news that galvanizes people and gets them angry? And I think you partially answered that with the media being weaker than you'd like to see subsequently. But how do we just raise the profile of these things to get people behind it?
Well, the thing is, there is no silver bullet. Organizing, it's like the grunt work of social change. You know, everyone wants to look for the one thing. Everyone wants do you remember the Coney 2012 video or the ice bucket challenge? Everyone's looking for those things that are going to go viral and they're going to, you know, ding, everyone's going to be talking about my issue or this particular problem. Pretty rare. And, you know, extremely rare for one person to have an impact, you know, the Greta phenomena. However, the small things add up. So part of what I do when I do campaign training is to talk about creating objectives for what you want to do that you can meet. So solving climate change on an individual level is not an objective you can meet. But getting 2 cities to endorse the fossil fuel treaty this year, an individual could probably do that with some good organizing. An organization saying they're going to get 1,000 citizens in my neighborhood. I'm going to get 100 citizens in my neighborhood to write to my MLA about X. You know, so trying to create objectives that put you on a pathway towards making change that you can meet, because success is absolutely critical to this work. We have to be able to see success along the way, or else it's just depressing. And success builds. So specifically to answer your question though about mainstream media, letters to the editor are critical for 2 reasons. One is people read them because they know they are actually getting stuff people wrote instead of, you know, in the can op-eds and, you know, etc. So people read them. They have a high rate of readership. Secondly, the newspapers look at how many, they aggregate it. Wow, 20 people wrote us this week about the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We should look into how much construction that has happened, and you know, what are the finances of it right now. You might actually get a journalist put on that story because they know that their readers are interested in that. So it's really just like the politicians. How many calls do they get? How many petitions do they get? How many letters to the editor? Emailing individual reporters. Don't be a hassle to them because they hate that. Don't send anyone. I get this all the time. I heard your talk and it was great. And I've been doing some research. I'm wondering what you think of this. 12 attachments, 400 pages. And I'm like, I don't think about that. Because and neither will an MP or an MLA or a reporter. The golden rule of thumb, never more than 2 pages, give them bullet points. For a reporter or a decision maker, you want bullet points. You want to be able, why should I care now, especially for a reporter or a government decision maker, why should I care now? Why does it matter to me or to my government or to my news outlet? Why is it news right now? Like these are the kind of things you want to just address up front. You might capture their attention. I want to also, while I'm talking, there was some in the chat about what can individual citizens do. What do I tell my neighbor if they get depressed about the political influence of the lobby, etc.? Any person can get a meeting with their MLA or MP. Even before I started doing this work, even before I had my first job with Greenpeace, I had met, because it was part of the culture of my household. My granny used to have tea with her MP once a year. And they would come over and they would have a chat. And she'd like, well, I voted for them. Like it used to be that it was part of our culture. They work for us, the politicians. If you're in, you can call anyone up in your riding and you can meet with them. And I have encouraged my children to do this too. My son has met with his MPs, met with his MLA. And I often just allocate time in my schedule. I'm going to write a letter to my MLA or MP on issues I don't normally work on because they're issues that I care about. Agricultural land and how much of it is being destroyed right now in British Columbia. I think our future is in growing food. I don't work on food issues, but that's one of the issues I work on. Reconciliation, Indigenous rights, equity, child poverty. These are issues that I don't work on every day, but I do the work, which doesn't take long, to figure out which group do I respect on this issue? How can I get the information I need? Enough to have a couple talking points to talk to my decision maker. You don't need to be an expert. You need to be a concerned voter. That's your job. somehow we think that what we buy is the most important thing we can do on climate change. You sure, buy a Tesla if you can afford it, buy the right light bulbs. But this issue is not going to be solved with better light bulbs. It's going to be solved with better laws. So if you only have 10 minutes, call your MLA. It's more important. On our individual carbon footprint, I'm not saying don't worry about your individual carbon footprint, but I am saying that your engagement in civil society as a voter is more important. And on your individual carbon footprint, take the time to learn about what matters and what doesn't. Probably some of the most impactful things you can do are eating less meat and flying less. I don't know about your personal circumstances, so I can't give everybody a recipe. People always want a recipe. Well, what should I do? I would say that from all of my research, those are the two things that matter most in your individual carbon footprint. How much you fly, which yay for us, none of us are doing that now, and how much meat you consume. But there's also obvious things. You know, I made a decision 10 years ago to stop buying wine that didn't come from British Columbia, because at least I knew that all those heavy bottles didn't have to be on a plane or a train or a boat. And I like wine. And that way I'm also supporting my local economy. There are some things that you can do and then they add up. I bet 10 years of that wine carbon footprint might be considerable.
I think that we have time for one, maybe two questions, but we'll go with Vinny Rao because he's up there in the queue. Vinny, it's back to you if you want to unmute. All right, there we go.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Tzeporah. I believe you pretty much answered my question just now. I don't know if I need to re-ask how we should get out of being duped by our own governments and outmarketed and outlobbied by the oil and gas corporations. You've pretty much answered that. It may be hard for some of us in the big cities to sit down for a cup of tea with our local MP, but it can be done. So I'll revise my question a little bit. Regarding the transition to non-fossil fuels such as hydrogen, what are your concerns and how do you think we can get around the large oil and gas corporations now basically faking it with gray hydrogen or even black hydrogen, if you will, when we really need green and blue hydrogen to run the future? Thank you.
I think that's a fascinating question because, you know, well, first of all, there's a lot of, I'll say, there's a lot of environmental, other environmental advocates that I work with who would take a more conservative approach to carbon capture and storage and geoengineering or even hydrogen than I do. And I'll just say that out front. I mean, there's lots of controversy around all of this stuff. I think part of that is because every time we find a new solution, the fossil fuel industry grabs onto it and tries to show how that technological solution will allow us to just continue business as usual. And everybody wants that. We want our cake and eat it too. You know, Trudeau, we want our Trans Mountain pipeline to fund our windmills. It's easier that way. We like to say yes and not no. It's just human psychology. That said, I think my read of the science and the math is that we need it all. We are at the point that we already have 414 parts per million of carbon in our atmosphere as of last week. And safe is 350. We are already at the point where too much carbon is trapped into our atmosphere and hundreds of thousands of people are suffering the consequences. So yes, we need technologies to draw carbon out of our atmosphere. We need new technologies. And that's one of the most amazing thing about the human society is ingenuity. And, you know, so we have a new facility in British Columbia that is an air capture and storage facility. I think it's amazing. It's pulling air. It's not even near a coal plant or something. It's just sitting in a beautiful area, actually, Howe Sound in Squamish. And it pulls air, filters it, takes the carbon out of the air, attaches the carbon to little particles of sand, and carbon pellets shoot out the bottom. I spent a day there just meeting with the engineers and trying to understand the technology. It's totally fascinating. If it's actually fed by renewable energy, instead of using fossil fuels to get fossil fuels out, then it works. If it's actually fed by renewable energy and then that carbon remains stable, it becomes park benches or roads or whatever, then it works. Now that particular facility is owned by Murray Edwards, who also owns CNRL, one of the largest oil companies in Canada. His plan is to take the carbon out of the air and make it into gas and sell it. So while it's kind of better than taking new carbon out of the ground, it's still taking carbon in the air and then polluting it again. So I think with all of these issues, carbon capture and storage, and many other issues, it's all about who's doing it and for what, and does it move us to a truly renewable, cleaner, and safer economy? Now, I don't know a lot about hydrogen. I've just started researching it, but from what I understand, you can clean hydrogen has already begun. You can create hydrogen on different scales from different things. Gray hydrogen means that you're actually creating hydrogen from fossil fuels. So this is an attempt by the fossil fuel industry to get in there and control the hydrogen production. And so, again, if we start from a place of saying, we know that we have to use less fossil fuels, that fossil fuel production and use has to decline to 2050 to zero, then all of our plans start from that basis. And by the way, if you take the existing fields globally of oil, gas, and coal that are currently producing and allow them a natural managed decline, because they do decline, there's a finite amount of fossil fuels in each field, that is roughly equivalent with a 2-degree world. And roughly equivalent with the projections of what we can do under 100% solutions projections that are currently out there, both from, there's many, but IPCC, IRENA, Stanford, Mark Jacobson's. So we actually have enough. We have enough fossil fuels right now to use to fuel the transition. And so I think the question is not what they're used for. Even using some of existing fossil fuels for hydrogen would be fine, I think, if we have an agreement of capping the world's fossil fuel production and allowing it to decline. So it's not really a black and white issue or answer, but I think we need to be very, very careful. And the easy lens that I use is, will it decrease or increase emissions? It's not rocket science. We need to be decreasing emissions from here on in. Will it decrease or increase our dependency on fossil fuel production? Fossil fuels, again, are 80% of the climate problem. So we make it more complicated than it needs to be.
I think it's a great place to stop the Q&A session. So I'm going to pass it to Emma just to wrap us up. But first, a note from me personally: thank you for your super inspiring talk and your leadership. I'll send it to Emma.
Thank you so much, Tan-Hoom. And again, I'd like to reiterate, thank you so much for sharing your insight and knowledge with all of us. Really, it's invaluable to us all, and we're so happy to be able to sit here and listen. I also want to just thank everyone behind the scenes this webinar series possible. So obviously today, Claudia and Tan-Hoom for helping facilitate everything, and of course the School of Environment for having us connect in this virtual platform, especially Jessica for all her hard work over these last few months to make this all possible. Thank you. And everyone here as well, participants make these things go around and make the Q&As and everything possible. So thank you guys for coming. If you have any questions or feedback or anything like that, Jessica is going to be sharing her email just in the chat. So if you want to let her know. We're going to have some more events coming out in the fall, so definitely keep an eye out. And thank you everyone again for coming out. This has been a great summer webinar series, so thank you. And we can sign off there, I guess. Thanks everybody.
Great, thanks, take care.
Thank you, everyone.